The pen felt wrong in her hand. Too light. Too light, too cheap for something that was about to change her entire life. Clara Thompson pressed the tip against the dotted line, and for a split second, she noticed her fingers trembling. On the table beside her elbow, a coffee cup with a small chip on its rim rattled softly against its saucer. She blamed the rattle on the October wind shaking the windows of the real estate office. Deep down, she knew it was her. 30-4 years old, and here she was, buying a homestead in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska. Back in Columbus, Ohio, her co-workers at the public library had thrown her a little going-away party. They'd given her a gift basket with fancy lotions and a book about pioneering women. Carol, from reference desk, had whispered, "Are you sure about this, Clara?" Alone, Clara had just smiled that tight, polite smile she'd perfected over 15 years behind the circulation desk. Alone was exactly what she wanted. Alone was safe. Alone meant no one left dishes in the sink or forgot to put the cap back on the toothpaste. The real estate agent, a man named Gerald, who smelled like menthol cough drops and wore a tie that had gone out of style in 1985, pushed the papers closer to her. Last chance to back out. "Missy," he said, not unkindly. "It's not a condo. It's work. Real work." Clara signed her name, Clara Ann Thompson. The letters looked sharp and proper against the legal jargon. She slid the paper back to him. Gerald folded it slowly, then cleared his throat, in that way people do when they have something awkward to say. "Now," he said, not meeting her eyes, "those. One more thing. Well, it's in the addendum here. Property includes man. Must take both." Clara blinked. She laughed. A short, surprised sound. "Is that a joke? Light? A scarecrow or something?" Jarrell just shook his head, his jowls wobbling, slid a photograph across the desk. It was old, creased down the middle, showing a man in a denim jacket, holding the reins of a horse. The man wasn't smiling, too. He looked like he'd been carved out of the same dirt as the land behind him. "He came with the original purchase back in '89, Gerald explained, keeping his voice low. "Bank foreclosed on the ranch, but the man, Jake, you wouldn't leave, said he'd die on that land. Lawyers couldn't figure out how to evict him legally, so when the property went up for sale, they just included him. It's in the fine print. He's part of the deed." Clara stared at the photograph. This had to be some kind of prank. A human being included with real estate, like a dishwasher or a riding lawnmower. "You're telling me there's a man living on my property right now? He's been there since 1984. "Ma'am, 'tis land. Really was. Before the bank took it, he just stayed." The coffee cup rattled again. Clara pressed her hand flat on the table to steady it. This was fine. She could handle this. She'd handled the old man who came into the library every day and smelled like cat pee. She'd handled the summer reading program with 400 screaming children. She could handle one stubborn cowboy she drove out that same afternoon in her sensible used Toyota, the back seat stuffed with boxes labeled kitchen and books in her neat handwriting. The road turned from pavement to gravel to hard-packed dirt. The sky got bigger and bigger, until it felt like the whole world was just empty blue and brown grass. Her little car bumped along a rutted drive, past a windmill that creaked in the wind, and stopped in front of a house with a chipped blue door. It was smaller than she'd expected, more tired. A porch sagged in the middle like an old horse, but it was hers. Clara climbed out, her good flats sinking slightly into the mud. Air smelled different here, not like car exhaust and coffee shops. Smelled like damp earth and something green and something else she couldn't name. She walked up to the chipped blue door, key in hand, feeling like an explorer on the moon. The door swung inward before she touched it. He stood in the doorway, blocking the light from inside. Close. He was taller than the photograph suggested. Tears. His denim jacket was worn soft at the elbows, and over his arm he carried a shotgun, broken open at the barrel. Safe, her librarian brain noted. Unloaded, but still, a shotgun. His eyes were the color of faded denim, and they looked at her the way she might look at a book with a torn cover. Assessed, found wanting. "You're not my boss, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and rough. like gravel rolling in a creek. Wasn't mean. Exactly, it was just final. A door closing. Clara's mouth opened, but nothing came out. She prepared speeches. She'd rehearsed little speeches in the car. Hello, I'm Clara. I'm the new owner. I think we can work something out. But all of that evaporated like morning frost. The chip on her coffee cup, scoo. The trembling pen to photograph. And now, this man, this actual flesh and blood man, standing on her porch like he owned it. Which, she supposed, he once had. She looked past him, into the dim kitchen. She could see a wood-burning stove, a sink with a hand pump, a table with 2 chairs. On the table sat a mason jar with a single wildflower in it. That small, almost pretty detail felt like a betrayal. This wasn't a abandoned house. This was someone's home. The shotgun shifted on his arm. You're gonna stand there all day, or you've got business. Clara's hand tightened on her key, the metal bit, into her palm. She thought about her apartment in Columbus, the quiet, the way she knew exactly what each day would bring. Then, she thought about the way her co-workers had looked at her at that going away party. Pity. They'd looked at her with pity. 40 years from now, she'd still be stamping due dates, still going home to an empty apartment, still waiting for a life that never started. This was the start. This messy, complicated, terrifying start. I have business, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Tyona's house. And apparently, I own you. Something flickered in his eyes. Not anger. Something older. Something that looked like grief. He stepped aside, just enough for her to squeeze past. She crossed the threshold. She caught his smell. Horses, hay, wood smoke. And underneath all of that, something sharp and cold, like the air before a blizzard. The door closed behind her with a solid thunk dot inside. The kitchen was warm. A fire crackled in the wood stove. The floor was clean, swept too. The counter held a loaf of bread wrapped in a cloth, a block of cheese, a jar of honey. Doors a kitchen that was lived in, used, loved. Clara stood in the middle of it, still holding her key, and realized she was the intruder here. She was the one who didn't belong. Jake hung the shotgun on 2 pegs by the door. Hooves. He moved slow, deliberate, like a man who'd learned that hurrying led to mistakes. When he turned back to face her, his expression hadn't changed. Supper's at 6, he said. Hope you like rabbit stew. Then he walked out the back door, letting in a gust of cold air before it slammed shut behind him. Clara stood alone in her new kitchen. Through the window, she watched him cross the yard toward the barn. His limp barely noticeable, his silhouette dark against the dying sun. The wind picked up, rattling the windows. Somewhere outside, a horse whinnied. She looked down at the key in her hand. It was just a piece of metal. It didn't mean anything here, not yet. On the table, next to that mason jar with its brave little flower, sat her deed. She'd carried it in without thinking. The coffee stain from Gerald's office had dried into a brown ring. Right through the words property includes man. Clara touched the stain with one finger. Was rough. Raised a scar on the paper. Outside, the wind blew harder. Those flakes of snow began to fall, fat and wet and early. Winter was coming, and she had no idea what she'd gotten herself into. But for the first time in years, as she stood in that strange kitchen with rabbit stew bubbling on the stove and a stranger in her barn, Clara Thompson didn't feel alone. She felt something else entirely. She felt alive. The smell hit Clara first. It was sharp and hot, and so thick she could almost taste it. Manure, fresh manure, steaming in the cold October air, clinging to the bottom of her brand new boots. The ones she'd bought special for this adventure. The ones the catalog had promised were perfect for country living. They were not perfect for country living. Clara stood in the middle of a horse stall, a pitchfork in her gloved hands, staring at a mess that seemed to multiply the longer she looked at it. The horse, a big chestnut mare, with kind eyes, watched her with what Clara could swear was amusement. Behind her, she heard a sound, a short, rough sound. Jake was laughing, not out loud, but his shoulders shook just slightly as he leaned against the barn door, a coil of wire in his hand. "It's not funny," Clara muttered, jabbing the pitchfork at the straw. The tines bounced off the frozen ground. "Ma'am, you're gonna hurt yourself." He walked over, his boots making soft thuds on the packed dirt. Pee up close. He smelled like cigarettes and coffee, and something piney. Soap. Maybe the man used soap. Dith. Surprised Clara more than it should have. He took the pitchfork from her hands. His fingers brushed hers, rough and calloused, and Clara pulled back like she'd been burned. Jay either didn't notice or didn't care. Slid the pitchfork under the mess in one smooth motion, lifted, and dumped it into a wheelbarrow Clara hadn't even seen. Like this, he said, not like you're fighting it. Clara watched, her cheeks burning. She'd been here 3 days, and she still couldn't do anything right. The stove smoked when she lit it. Burr. Pump in the kitchen squealed like a dying animal every time she wanted water. Now, she couldn't even clean a simple stall. The mare nickered and bumped Clara's shoulder with her nose, soft, warm. Clara reached up without thinking and stroked the velvet muzzle. The horse leaned into her hand, and for a moment, something loosened in Clara's chest. "That's Daisy," Jake said, not looking at her. "She likes you." She'd on, like most people. It wasn't a compliment, exactly, but it felt like one. The next morning, Clara woke to cold so bitter it stole her breath. Lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, watching her own breath fog in the air. The wood stove had gone out sometime in the night. Again, she dressed in 3 layers, her fingers numb and clumsy with buttons. When she walked into the kitchen, the pump handle was frozen solid. No amount of pushing or pulling would make it move. No water meant no coffee. No coffee meant no thinking. Clara pulled on her coat and stumbled outside. The world had transformed overnight. Snow covered everything, deep and silent, muffling all sound. The barn stood dark against the white. A single light glowed in the small window of the tack room. Jake's room. He lived in the barn. She'd learned that the first night. After he'd brought her stew and then disappeared into the darkness, she trudged through the snow, her boots sinking past her ankles. By the time she reached the barn door, her toes had gone numb and her nose was running. She'd pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. Warmth hit her like a wall. The smell of hay and horses and that same piney soap. Jake stood by the tack room door, a coffee mug in his hand. Tea. He looked at her wet boots, her red nose, her shaking hands. "Pump's frozen," she said, her voice came out small, embarrassed. He nodded, like this was exactly what he'd expected. Then, he held out his mug. "Drink this or fix it." Clara took the mug. The ceramic was warm in her hands, almost too hot. She wrapped her fingers around it and breathed in the steam. It was the best coffee she'd ever tasted. Jake pulled on a heavier coat and grabbed a toolbox from the shelf. At the door, he paused. "Coming, chill. Want to learn this?" It wasn't a question. But it wasn't an order either, with something in between. An invitation. Maybe. Clara followed. The cold outside slapped her face, but she kept walking, following his broad back toward the house. He knelt by the pump, his breath clouding, and began taking it apart, piece by piece. Metal parts lay in the snow, dark against the white. Clara knelt beside him, her knees soaking through her jeans. "Watch," he said. "See this here?" She pointed to a small rubber piece, worn out. "That's why it froze. Needs replacing." He showed her how. His hands moved slow, deliberate, making sure she saw each step. When he let her try, her cold fingers fumbled, and she waited for his impatience. But he just waited. Silent still. Finally, the new piece fit. Jay poured hot water from a thermos over the pump mechanism, then nodded at her. "Try it now." Clara grabbed the handle and pushed down. Water coughed, sputtered, then flowed in a steady stream, clear and cold and perfect. She laughed, a real laugh this time. Surprised and happy, Jake almost smiled. Almost that night. The blizzard hit. Clara heard it coming hours before it arrived. The wind picked up, moaning around the corners of the house. The temperature dropped so fast, she could feel it through the walls. By dusk, she couldn't see the barn from her kitchen window, just white. Endless moving white. She stoked the stove high and wrapped herself in every blanket she owned. The wind screamed, the house shook, and Clara sat in the dark, listening to the storm try to tear her new life apart. Around midnight, a knock came at the door. 3 hard raps, then nothing. Clara's heart stopped. She grabbed the fireplace poker, the only weapon she had, and crept to the door. Who's there? Jake. She pulled open the door. Snow swirled in, stinging her face. Jake stood there, covered in white, his lashes frosted, his jaw tight. Ski held something in his arms. A box, a wooden box. Barn's not safe, he said. Roof's going. Clara stepped back, stomped the snow off his boots and came inside, setting the box on her kitchen table. Then, he just stood there, dripping on her floor, not looking at her. Sit by the stove, Clara said. You're freezing. He didn't argue. That's when she knew he was colder than he let on. T sat on the floor with his back against the wood stove, his long legs stretched out, his eyes closed. Clara wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. He flinched at her touch, then relaxed. She made coffee, strong and hot. When she handed him the mug, their fingers touched again, and this time Clara didn't pull away. Neither did he. The storm raged on. Hours passed. Clara sat at the table, watching him. Firelight played across his face, softening the hard lines. He looked younger in the dim light, or maybe just more human. But when he finished the coffee, he set the mug aside and reached for the wooden box. Sue opened it, slow, careful, like it held something holy. Inside, Clara saw papers, photographs, a faded blue ribbon. Jake pulled out a folded document and handed it to her. Marriage certificate. Shri. Clara Thompson held her breath as she read the names. Jake O'Luce, Warren, Mary Elizabeth Bennett, dated June 12, 1984. Mary, Clara whispered. She's gone now, whose voice was flat. Empty. 6 years, cancer took her fast. Clara said nothing. There was nothing to say. He pulled out another paper, newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle. A photograph showed a younger Jake, grinning wide, standing next to a massive bull. The caption read, "Local rancher Jacob Warren takes top prize at county fair. Vern says he plans to expand his herd and put Broken Willow on the map." Broken Willow. That was the name of this place. Clara hadn't known it had a name. What happened? She asked. Jake stared at the photograph for a long time. She got sick. I stopped paying attention to the ranch. Debts piled up. Bank took it all. He looked up at her, and his eyes were wet. They took my land. They took my home. But I wasn't leaving her. Not while she was still here. Clara thought about the shotgun, the way he'd stood in her doorway, the way he'd said, "You're not my boss." He wasn't being stubborn. He was protecting the only thing he had left. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the fire crackled. Clara sat across from a stranger who wasn't quite a stranger anymore. Toward dawn, the storm began to die. The wind dropped to a whisper. The house stopped shaking. Jake stood up, stiff from sitting on the floor, and walked to the window. Gray light filtered through the frost. "Roof held," he said. "Remade it." Clara joined him at the window. Snow covered everything. Drifts reached halfway up the barn doors. For the world was new, white, silent. "Jake," Clara said. He turned. She looked at him. This man she'd bought without knowing. This man who'd lost everything and stayed anyway. Thank you for the pump. For staying. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once and reached for his coat. At the door, he paused. Without turning around, he said, "Mary would have let it burn." Then he walked out into the snow, leaving Clara standing in the warm kitchen, holding a coffee mug with a chipped rim, wondering what exactly she'd gotten herself into. And for the first time, wondering if maybe, just maybe, she'd found something she didn't know she'd been looking for. Spring came to Broken Willow like a fist wrapped in velvet. One day, the snow still clung to the north side of the barn, and the next, mud swallowed everything. Thick, brown, hungry mud that sucked up Clara's boots with every step and made the short walk to the barn feel like a marathon. April 17th. Clara remembered the date because she'd marked it on the calendar she'd hung in the kitchen. The same calendar she'd used back in Ohio, covered in library staff meetings and dentist appointments. Now, the squares sat mostly empty, waiting for a life she hadn't figured out how to live yet. The mud was worse than the cold had ever been. The cold. At least, you could fight, too. You could add another layer, stuff rags in the windows, huddle closer to the stove. But the mud just waited, patient, hungry. It pulled at her feet and splattered her jeans and turned every chore into a battle. Clara had been here 6 months now. 6 months since she'd signed that deed in Gerald's stuffy office. 6 months since a man with a shotgun had told her she wasn't his boss. Still, in some ways, it felt like a lifetime. In others, it felt like she'd arrived yesterday. She still didn't fit. The barn loomed ahead, dark against the gray sky. Stewed in the corral, her chestnut coat caked with mud, looking as miserable as Clara felt. Bet it wasn't Daisy Clara was thinking about. It was the sound she'd heard an hour ago, a sound she'd never forget as long as she lived. The cow had been laboring since dawn, a young heifer, first calf. Nothing special about her except she belonged to Jake, and that made her matter. Clara had been in the house, trying to wrestle the pump into submission, when she heard Jake shout, not words, just sound, urgent and sharp. She'd run through the mud, her boots slipping, her heart pounding. By the time she reached the barn, the sound had changed, lower now, strain and struggle. Inside the barn smelled like blood and birth and something else, something warm and terrifying. Jake knelt in the straw, up to his elbows in something Clara couldn't look at directly. The heifer lay on her side, eyes rolling white with fear and pain. And between them, half in and half out of this world, was a calf. But it was wrong. Clara didn't know anything about cows, but she knew wrong when she saw it. The legs were bent backward, the head was twisted, nothing was where it should be. Get behind her, Jake said, too. His voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. Push. When I tell you, Clara wanted to say she didn't know how. She wanted to say she was a librarian from Ohio who sorted books and shushed loud children. She wanted to say this wasn't her life, wasn't her cow, wasn't her problem. Instead, she got behind the heifer and pushed. What happened next lived in Clara's memory like a photograph. The heat of the animal against her hands, the slick feel of fur and fluid, Jake's voice, low and steady, talking her through each moment. Then, suddenly, the calf sliding free in a rush of warmth and wet, landing in the straw with a soft thump dot. Jake worked fast, clearing the nose, rubbing the small body with rough straw. Pick calf wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. Clara watched frozen as Jake leaned down and breathed into those tiny nostrils. Once, twice. On the third try, the calf coughed, a small wet sound. Then, it blinked. Clara sat back in the straw and cried. Jake didn't say anything. He just kept working, cleaning the calf, checking the heifer, making sure both were okay. By the time he finished, Clara had stopped crying. She just sat there, covered in blood and birth and barn dirt, watching him move through this world she didn't understand. Later, standing at the kitchen sink with a basin of warm water, Clara watched the pink water swirl down the drain. Her hands were raw, her arms ached, her back screamed every time she moved. But none of that compared to what she saw in the mirror above the sink. A woman she didn't recognize. Looked back. This woman had mud in her hair and circles under her eyes. Her skin was tanned and chapped, nothing like the pale indoor complexion she'd worn in Ohio. This woman had seen a life begin today, had helped, had pushed and strained and cried. This woman was not a librarian anymore, but she wasn't a rancher either. Clara dried her hands slowly and walked to the table. A letter sat there, propped against the salt shaker. It had arrived 3 days ago, buried in a stack of mail Gerald had forwarded from Ohio. The envelope was thick and cream-colored, with a law firm's return address in elegant script. She'd been avoiding it, but tonight, with the memory of birth still fresh on her skin, she opened it. The letter was from a firm in Columbus. They represented the library board. Her old job was still open, head of circulation, good pay, benefits, pension. They wanted her back. They'd hold the position until June 1st. June 1st, 6 weeks away. Clara set the letter down and stared at the kitchen wall. 2. The calendar hung there, still turned to April. She thought about the apartment in Columbus, the quiet order, the way she knew exactly where everything belonged. She thought about her co-workers, her routines, her life. Then she thought about the cough, the way it had coughed and blinked and lived. The way Jake had looked at her afterward, just for a second, with something that might have been respect. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket. Outside, the mud waited, the barn waited, the life she'd stumbled into waited. Clara walked back to the barn. The sun had set, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. The mud pulled at her boots, but she didn't fight it anymore. She just walked, inside the barn. Jake sat on a bale of hay, watching the heifer and her calf. The little one was nursing now, its tail flicking with each swallow. Jake didn't look up when Clara came in, but he shifted on the bale, making room. Clara sat beside him, not close, but close enough. For a long time, neither spoke. The barn settled around them, horses breathing soft in their stalls, hay rustling, the small sounds of animals at peace. She almost didn't make it. Jake finally said, "The heifer, first calf's always hard, but that one." He nodded toward the calf. That one wanted to live. Clara thought about the letter in her pocket, the job in Ohio, the easy life waiting for her. "Why do you stay?" she asked. "I mean, really, things you could leave any time. The deed says you're included, but it's not like I could stop you, so why do you stay?" Jake was quiet for a long time. The lantern, hanging from a beam, cast long shadows across his face. "Where would I go?" he asked, not bitter, just honest. This is all I know. These animals. This land. I leave here. I'm nobody." "You're nobody here too," Clara said, then winced. That came out wrong. But Jake just nodded. "Maybe. But here, I'm nobody who matters to a few cows and a horse. That's more than most people got." Clara pulled the letter from her pocket. She didn't read it, just held it. "I got a job offer today," she said. "Bag in Ohio. My old job, good money, it's easy life." Jake looked at the letter, then at her. His eyes were hard to read in the dim light. "You gonna take it?" Clara thought about the question, really thought. She thought about the apartment in Columbus, clean and quiet and empty. She'd thought about the library, the smell of books, the hush of the reading room. She thought about never waking up to frozen pumps again, never smelling manure, never watching a calf take its first breath. "I don't know," she said. Jake nodded. He stood up, stretched his back, and walked over to the stall to heifer load softly as he checked the calf again. Satisfied, he turned back to Clara. "Mary used to say, a prison's still a prison, even with new wallpaper." The words hung in the warm barn air. Clara felt them land in her chest like stones. She looked around the barn, the rough-hewn beams, the dusty hay, the animals that depended on Jake for everything. Then she thought about her apartment, her job, her life, all that order, all that quiet, all that emptiness. A prison with new wallpaper. Clara sat on the hay bale, the letter crumpling in her fist, and realized the truth she'd been running from since the day she arrived. She hadn't bought a homestead. She'd bought a cage and called it freedom. She'd convinced herself that owning land meant something, that being in charge meant something, that signing her name on a dotted line would transform her into someone new. But she was still the same Clara, still running from empty rooms, still hoping that if she just found the right place, the right person, the right life, she'd finally feel whole. But you couldn't buy whole. You couldn't buy belonging. You couldn't buy a reason to wake up in the morning, and you definitely couldn't buy a person and call it companionship. Jake leaned against the stall, watching her, not waiting for an answer, just watching, like he'd seen this moment coming from the very first day. The barn was warm. The animals were quiet. Somewhere outside, the mud waited, patient and hungry. Clara sat on a hay bale in Nebraska, holding a letter from Ohio day, and realized she had no idea who she was anymore. Or maybe, for the first time in her life, she was finally ready to find out. The lantern flickered, the calf nursed, and Clara Thompson, age 34, librarian, homesteader, woman who'd bought a man without knowing it, sat in the dark and faced the hardest question of all. If she stayed, what would she be staying for? And if she left, what would she be leaving behind? Lee. The summer heat arrived like an unwanted guest who refused to leave. By mid-June, the Nebraska sun had baked the mud, turned to hard-cracked earth that sparkled, too, with mica and reminded Clara of nothing so much as the glitter she'd used for story time. Crafts back in Ohio. The temperature hit 94 degrees on the morning of June 18th, and by noon, it had climbed past 100. Clara sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, not the neat stacks she used to manage at the library. These were different. Government forms, grant applications, agricultural subsidy requests, pages and pages of them, each one more complicated than the last, covered in questions about crop rotations and livestock counts and something called conservation compliance that made her head spin. But Clara understood paperwork. Paperwork was a language she spoke fluently. For the past 6 weeks, since the night in the barn when she'd held that letter from Ohio and faced the truth about herself, Clara had been busy. She hadn't made a decision about staying or leaving, not consciously, but her hands had made the choice for her. Morning, she woke up, made coffee in the chipped cup, got to work. Jake thought she was crazy. He'd stand in the kitchen doorway, tracking in dust and hay, and watch her bent over the table with her stack of forms and her reference books and her careful notes. "What's all that?" he'd ask. Clara would explain, again, about the grant programs she'd found through online research at the library in town. About the money available for small ranchers, the sustainable agriculture initiatives that could help them diversify. Jake would nod, not understanding, and go back to his cows. But something had shifted between them. Clara noticed it in small ways. The way Jake left the coffee made when she came down in the morning. The way he'd point out things around the ranch without her asking. The way he said when he talked about the place. "We need to mend that fence. We should move the cattle to the north pasture." Small things, but they added up. July 3rd, Clara remembered the date because it was the day before the county fair, and because it was the day everything changed. She was in the barn, checking on the calf she'd helped birth back in April. The little one had grown into a feisty heifer with a white blaze on her forehead, and an attitude that reminded Clara of herself. Daisy stood nearby, dozing in the heat, one back leg cocked in that lazy way horses have. Clara heard the car before she saw it. Engines were rare on the dirt road leading to Broken Willow. Visitors were even rarer. She walked to the barn door and watched a shiny black truck creep up the drive, moving slow like it was judging everything it passed. The truck stopped by the house. A man got out. He was maybe 50. With a gut straining against a fancy western shirt and boots that looked like they'd never touched actual dirt. His hair was too dark for his age, slicked back with something that gleamed in the sun. And on his feet, impossibly, were shoes the color of mustard, bright yellow shoes that clashed with everything around them. Clara walked toward him. Heat shimmered off the ground, making the man wobble like a mirage. "You must be the new owner," he said, holding out a hand. His smile was too wide, too white. Names: Crockett, Vernon Crockett. Alone. The spread over east, about 10 miles that way. He waved vaguely. Clara shook his hand. His palm was soft, moist. She wiped her hand on her jeans when he wasn't looking. "What can I do for you, Mr. Crockett?" Say laughed, a big booming sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Call me Vern, and I'll get right to it. I'm here to make you an offer on this place." Clara's stomach tightened. Not interested. "Now hold on." He reached into his truck and pulled out a folder. "Just take a look. The price is more than fair. More than fair." He named a number. Clara's knees went weak. It was enough to pay off everything she owed. Enough to go back to Ohio with money in the bank. Enough to buy a nice little house near the library. Maybe even retire early if she was careful. Enough to erase this whole experiment and start over. Vern Crockett saw her face and smiled that too wide smile. "See, a woman like you must be tired of all this mess, all this work. I'm offering you a way out." Clara heard footsteps behind her. Jake, he'd come from the barn and now stood a few feet away, his face unreadable. Crockett looked at Jake like he was examining a piece of equipment. Sporen's still here. Ha, figured you'd have moved on by now. Found some place that actually wants you. Jake said nothing, just stood there waiting. Crockett turned back to Clara. Tell you what, I'll make it even sweeter. You sell to me. I'll even let Warren stay on as a hand if he wants. Who knows the land? Could be useful. He said it like he was offering to keep a stray dog. Clara looked at the folder in her hand. Thing. The numbers sat there in bold print, real and solid and tempting. Then she looked at Jake. His face hadn't changed, but his hands, hanging at his sides, had curled into fists. She thought about the past 8 months, the frozen pump, the blizzard, the calf, the way Jake had taught her to muck a stall and fix a fence, and never once made her feel stupid for not knowing. Thor, the way he'd sat with her in the barn that night and said, a prison's still a prison. This man with his yellow shoes and his soft hands and his two-eyed smile saw broken willow as dirt and buildings and profit, saw Jake as a piece of equipment, saw Clara as a woman who'd made a mistake and needed rescuing. He was wrong. Clara opened the folder, read the offer carefully, reword. Then she looked up at Crockett and smiled her librarian smile, the one she used on patrons who tried to sneak out with overdue books. The price just went up, Mr. Crockett. His smile faltered. Excuse me, Clara. Held up the folder. This is a fair offer for the land. I'll give you that. But you're not just buying land, or buying a working ranch with improved stock, sustainable practices, government grants already in the pipeline. She had no idea if the grants would actually come through, but Crockett didn't know that. And another 50,000, and we'll talk. Crockett stared at her, behind her. She heard Jake make a sound, something between a cough and a laugh. 50,000, Crockett sputtered. That's ridiculous, too. This place isn't worth. It's worth what someone will pay. Clara interrupted. No, and I'm not selling. Not today, not ever, too. That number was just to see how badly you wanted it. Now, I know you want it bad. Which means I should keep it. She handed the folder back to him. His face had gone red, the color creeping up from his collar. You're making a mistake, he said. Clara shook her head. No, I've made plenty of mistakes. Coming here, I thought was one of them. It turns out it was the smartest thing I ever did. She looked at Jake, then back at Crockett. Now, get off my land. Crockett stood there for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he climbed into his shiny truck, spun gravel getting turned around, and roared off down the drive. The dust settled slowly. Jake walked up beside Clara. They stood together, watching the truck disappear. You just turned down more money than I've seen in my whole life, he said quietly. I know why. Clara thought about it, really thought. There, the answer came easier than she expected. Because for the first time in my life, I'm building something, not buying something, not arranging something, building from the ground up. I'll be damned if I let some man in yellow shoes take it away from me. Jake was quiet for a long time. Then he said, that grant stuff, the paperwork. Is it real, or were you bluffing? Clara smiled. It's real. I've got 3 applications pending. One of them, the Sustainable AG1, I actually think we've got a good shot at. Perth. I need your help to make it work. The paperwork side, I can handle. The ranching side. She looked at him. Vets. You, Jake, met her eyes. For the first time since she'd arrived. There was no wall there, no distance. Just a man, tired and hopeful and maybe a little scared. What do you need? T.S. Clara started walking toward the house. Come inside. I'll show you. They spent the rest of that day at the kitchen table, going over the grant applications line by line. Jake explained the ranching parts she'd gotten wrong. She explained the government language he couldn't understand. Together, they filled in the blanks. By evening, the applications were ready to mail. Clara stacked them neatly, paper-clipped each one, and set them by the door for tomorrow's trip to town. Jake made supper, ribette stew, the same thing he'd made that first night. But this time, Clara sat at the table and ate with him. This time, they talked about the ranch, about the future. free, about small things and big things and everything in between. After supper, Jake walked to the door. He paused there like he always did, bet. This time, he turned back. Clara, she looked up. That thing you said today, about building something, day. I haven't felt like I was building anything since Mary died. Just surviving, just getting through. He swallowed hard, fag you. Then he walked out into the summer night. Clara sat at the table, the chipped coffee cup in her hands, and listened to the crickets sing. The kitchen was warm, the dishes were done, and, for the first time since she'd arrived at Broken Willow, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like home. Outside, the moon rose over the barn, over the corral, too, over the land she'd nearly sold and the life she'd nearly walked away from. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called. Another answered. The night went on, full of sound and life and possibility. Clara finished her coffee, rinsed the cup, and set it in the drying rack. Tomorrow, she'd drive to town and mail those applications. Tomorrow, the work would continue. Tomorrow, she and Jake would figure out the next piece of this puzzle they were building together. But tonight, she stood at the window and looked out at the land she'd bought, the man she'd somehow found, the life she'd never expected. The yellow shoes were gone. Thorfer was rejected. The easy way out had closed. And Clara Thompson, age 34, librarian, homesteader, woman who'd bought a man and found a partner, smiled into the darkness and felt, for the first time in her life, exactly where she belonged. The autumn light came through the kitchen window, soft and golden, the way it only does in October when the world knows winter is coming and wants to make the most of what's left. Clara sat at the table, the same table where she'd signed that deed 15 years ago, and ran her finger along the rim of her coffee cup. The chip was still there, small and rough against her skin, a tiny imperfection that had become, over the years, the most familiar thing in the world. 15 years. Could it really be that long? Clara looked at her hands wrapped around the warm ceramic day. They were different hands now. Stronger, the knuckles a little larger. From years of work, a thin white scar ran across her left thumb from the time the fence wire snapped and caught her wrong. For freckles on the backs that never faded anymore. Permanent marks from endless days in the Nebraska sun. She was 49 now. Silver ran through her dark hair in streaks that she'd stopped coloring years ago. Jake said he liked it, said it made her look distinguished. Clara had laughed at that. Librarians were distinguished. Ranchers were just weathered. The kitchen had changed, too. The cracked linoleum was long gone, replaced with wide pine boards that Jake had milled himself from trees that came down in the blizzard of '08. The windows were new to double-paned and tight. No more stuffing rags in the cracks when November hit. The wood stove still stood in the corner, but now it shared space with a modern propane range that Clara had insisted on after the third time she'd burned. Breakfast. But some things stayed the same. The pump handle still stood by the sink, though it was mostly decorative now. The real plumbing ran beneath the floor, installed in 2005 after the grant money finally came through. And on the wall, in a simple wooden frame, hung the old deed from that first day. The coffee stain was still there, brown and permanent. A map of that moment when everything changed. Clara looked at it sometimes and remembered the way her hands had trembled, the way she'd had no idea what she was getting into. She knew now. The floorboard creaked behind her. That same spot by the door, right where the joists had settled 100 years ago, and never stopped complaining. Tara smiled without turning around. "Morning," Jake said. His voice was rougher now, older. He moved slower these days. His limp more pronounced after 15 more years of working land that didn't care about human bodies. But he still got up before dawn every day, still made the coffee, still walked out to the barn to check on the animals before anything else. He set a bucket of apples on the counter, date harvest from the small orchard they'd planted together. Back in '03, the trees had seemed like a crazy idea then. DeHose. Everyone said apples wouldn't grow here, that the winters were too harsh, the summers too dry. But Clara had done the research, found the right varieties, and Jake had trusted her enough to try. Now they had more apples every fall than they knew what to do with. Pie, sauce, butter. They gave them away too. Neighbors traded them for things they needed. Left baskets on the porch for anyone who passed by. Jake poured himself coffee and sat across from her. His mug was newer, unchipped. One of us said Clara had bought at the county fair years ago. But he always reached for the chipped one first when he made her coffee. He said it was hers. They sat together in the comfortable silence that comes from 15 years of mornings. Towels outside. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, their leaves yellow and ready to fall. Rooster crowed somewhere. Daisy's great-granddaughter, a feisty mare named Penny, whinnied from the corral. On the table between them lay a thick envelope. Clara had opened it last night after Jake went to bed. Another grant renewal. D. The Sustainable Agriculture Program had become the backbone of Broken Willow, funding rotational grazing systems and water conservation projects that had turned the place into a model for small ranchers across the county. Young farmers came now. They showed up in battered trucks with hopeful eyes, wanting to learn how Jake and Clara had done it, how they'd kept the land productive without destroying it, how they'd built something that lasted. Clara always made them coffee in the chipped cup and told them the truth. It wasn't easy, wasn't romantic, it was work, day after day, year after year, but it was. There's Jake picked up the envelope and read the letter. His reading had improved over the years. Clara had taught him, sitting at this very table, using old farming manuals and seed catalogs as textbooks. Still, struggled with big words, but he could read a grant application well enough to know what he was agreeing to. Approved, he said, not a question. Approved, Clara confirmed. Another 5 years. Jake nodded, set the letter down, and went back to his coffee. No celebration. No fuss, just another morning, another yes, another day of the life they'd built. Clara looked at the wall above the table. The old deed hung there, coffee stain and all. Next to it, in a matching frame, hung a newer document. This one was clean and white. No stains, no creases. Ted 2 names on it, side by side. Clara Ann Thompson, Jake of Lewis Warren. They'd made it official in a small ceremony at the county courthouse. 7 years after she'd first arrived, no fuss, no crowd, just the two of them, and a judge who'd known Jake since they were boys. Afterward, they'd come home and Jake had grilled steaks, and they'd sat on the porch watching the sun go down. He'd given her a ring that had belonged to his mother, simple gold, worn thin at the edges. Clara wore it every day, and when she caught the light just right, she still smiled. Remember that first morning? Clara asked. When I showed up with my key and you had that shotgun. Jake almost smiled. The real smile, the one he saved just for her. You were so scared. Try not to show it. I could tell. I wasn't scared. Clara said, I was terrified. Same thing. Clara laughed. It was true. She'd been terrified of everything back then. Of him. Of the land. Of herself, most of all. The possibility that she'd made the biggest mistake of her life and there was no going back. She hadn't gone back. Not once. Not once. Not even when it got hard. And it got hard plenty of times. The drought of '04 that nearly killed the herd. The fire of '09 that took the old barn and everything in it. The winter of '12 when they were snowed in for 6 weeks and ran out of everything but each other. Through all of it, they'd stayed, not because they had to, not because some deeds said so, but because they chose to. Every single day, Jake finished his coffee and stood up. The limp was worse in the mornings. Before he got moving, he'd need a new hip soon, the doctor said. Jake just grunted whenever anyone mentioned it. He'd get it when he got it. Right now, there was work to do. Pasture fence needs checking, he said, before the snow comes. Clara nodded. I'll be out after I deal with these. She gestured at the pile of papers by her elbow. More grants, more applications, more planning for a future that stretched ahead of them, like the land itself. At the door, Jake paused. He did that, now, every time. A habit he'd developed somewhere along the way and never broken. Stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, looking back at her. You coming to town later? Need anything? Clara thought about it. Maybe some of that fancy coffee from the new place, too. The one that opened by the feed store. Jake nodded, too. The stuff you like. Got it. He pushed open the door. The autumn air rushed in, cool and clean, smelling of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. For a moment, the light caught him just right, and Clara could see the young man from that first photograph. The one with the prize ball and the big dreams, who was still in there, underneath the grey and the limp and the years. Then the door closed, and he was gone. Clara sat alone in the kitchen. The chipped cup sat before her, empty now. She ran her finger around the rim one more time, feeling that tiny imperfection. That small scar on the ceramic dot 15 years ago. That cup had rattled on its saucer while she signed away her old life. 15 years ago, she'd been so sure she knew what she was doing, so sure that buying land meant something, that owning things could fill the empty spaces inside. She'd been wrong about so much, but she'd been right about one thing. She'd come here looking for a life, and she'd found one. Nods because of the land, though the land was good. Nods because of the house, though it was home. But because of the man who'd stood in her doorway with a shotgun and told her she wasn't his boss. He'd been right too. She wasn't his boss. She was his partner, his friend, his wife. The coffee cup felt warm in her hands, even empty. Clara set it down carefully, right next to the stack of grant applications and the letter that said yes one more time. Through the window, she could see Jake walking toward the barn, slow and steady, the way he did everything. Penny waited by the gate, ears forward, watching him come. Behind the barn, the land rolled out to the horizon, brown and gold and ready for winter. Clara stood up. The floor creaked under her feet, that same spot by the door. She grabbed her jacket from the hook and shrugged it on. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But first, she paused at the door, just like Jake did. She looked back at the kitchen, at the table, at the two deeds hanging on the wall, the stained one and the clean one, the beginning and the now. Then she opened the door and walked out into the autumn morning, toward the barn, toward the man, toward the life she'd never planned and wouldn't trade for anything. The sun was warm on her face. There smelled like apples and hay and home. Somewhere behind her, the chipped coffee cup sat on the table, waiting for tomorrow morning, waiting for the next chapter, waiting for all the mornings still to come. Clara smiled and kept walking.